So thank you all for being here. It's interesting to see so many of you at this e-seminar on qualified digital archiving, on how to create trust and how to create a budget for innovation with that technology and that concept. And the presenter of this afternoon is Frederik Rosseel, the CEO of Dogbite. He has worked in information management for over 20 years as a consultant before starting Dogbite in 2006, which is a company that focuses on digital archiving, digitization, and process automation projects. He's been directly and indirectly involved in many, many projects. And so he has a lot of anecdotes, a lot of user stories, and a lot of practical information to offer. And he's been in digital archiving, I think, since 2012. Dogbite's first product was then around that time. So a lot of experience. And Frederik, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. So today we'll talk about how to create trust and budget for innovation with digital archiving. So today, from our side, from Dogbite, there's Michiel van Driessen, and he's been involved as a solution architect for the Dogbite core platform that we use for archiving since, how long? 10 years, Michiel? And
yeah, 10 years now, and counting.
Yeah. So next to that, over the years, he has logically also become a digital archiving specialist. So if you want to hear things about digital archiving that nobody can understand, he's the right guy to go to. So myself, I'm Frederik Rosseel, and I've already been introduced by Patrick. So what do we have on the agenda today? So first of all, what is digital archiving? So for those of you who don't know the concept or what it should do, an explanation first about what is digital archiving, then international standards or norms that are linked to digital archiving, the regulations that have been applied and put in place with regard to digital archiving, and then an explanation about why you should be implementing a digital archiving solution. Then we'll have a break, after some questions, a break, and after the break, Michiel will explain you how to do it. So how do you translate concepts of archiving into a solution? So the more technical stuff, that's his part of the day. So with Dogbite, we've always been involved in, later on, there's going to be a follow-up session, which is going to be more technical because today is going to be more of an overview, functional and technical. We're going to organize a follow-up session where we really talk about the different use cases of archiving. If we look at those different use cases, how can you use an archiving solution for that? Talk about implementation strategies. How can you easily implement or complement your existing environment with an archiving solution? The introduction of the Dogbite core platform and how we use that for digital archiving with a demo of the solution. So you can actually see it working and doing the stuff that it's supposed to do. You can register for that session if you want to using the form. I'll also paste the link to the form in the chat. And if you're interested in assisting to that next session, you can simply complete the form and you'll be invited. Okay. So as Dogbite, we've always been involved or been working for customers that used to have a lot of paper or still have a lot of paper in some cases. And why do they have a lot of paper or used to have a lot of paper? That's simply because they needed to archive that information. The simplest way in a lot of cases in the past was simply printing everything, storing it somewhere in a cupboard or in a big space, and preserve it for years to come. But of course, digital has been here for quite a while. And myself and Dogbite, we've been involved in several different archiving projects, digital archiving projects over the year. For me, the first one in which I was involved was the city archives of the city of Antwerp. And that was way back in 2000, where the first digital archiving solution in Belgium was implemented. And I was involved in implementing the metadata scheme and creating the web interface. After that, I worked as an SME, service matter expert for digital archiving and records management at the Flemish government. In 2006, we created a product called DocShifter, which can be used for format conversions, not just for document formats, but for any type of format. So video, image formats, in some cases even XML. So it's an any-to-any format conversion solution. Later on in 2010, we created our electronic patient archive solution, which has as a purpose, of course, archiving all types of information, because typically in healthcare environments, they've been working digitally for tens of years. And next to that, they have different types of formats that they need to archive, not just document formats, but also medical imagery, medical images, video, so all types of information. In 2012, we won an award for that one. And then later on in 2014, we started our own Perenity project, with which we've built our Dogbite core solution, which has been released in 2018. So what triggered us back in 2014? The person in the middle, who is not an unknown for some of the attendants, but he's responsible at the City Archives of Antwerp for everything related to digital archiving. And back in 2014, I've shown him what we had made for electronic patient archiving and the doc shifter solution. And he said, yeah, it was more telling us. Unfortunately, it was not a promise, clearly, but he said that he was ready to pay at least 50,000 euros a year if he could bring those two together, aligned with the international standards. And his name is Philippe Boudret. So, and so that's what he told us. Unfortunately, up until now, yeah, he hasn't paid us or bought a solution, but maybe that's coming in the future. So, but because of that, of course, if you heard that, we were clearly interested in adapting our solution and building that new solution, that digital archiving solution. If you look at an information lifecycle, it's also important to understand where information archiving comes in the information lifecycle. First of all, you have the content creation and capture, typically your word processing solution or a document capture solution. And next to that, the information that has been captured or that you've received from the outer world, to put it like that, has to be processed. Think of an insurance claim coming in, the information needs to be processed. And during that period, we have operational preservation. You need to be able to process that information. And typically, that's less than 1 month until a year. Okay, that's the amount of time it generally takes to process a case. Okay. After that, we'll have legal preservation or historical preservation. So the information that has to be preserved. So we have a contract that has been concluded. You have communication, a response that has been sent to a customer. There we're talking about legal preservation. And that goes from 1 year up until, at least in some cases, 100 years. If we're talking about 100 years, logically, in most cases, that's historical preservation. You also have to look at it this way. These days, a lot of information is no longer created on paper. Think about photography, which is the most common example, but those images are created digitally. Also, the images that have cultural importance are also digitally created and need to be preserved in a digital way. It's a word that I've already been using a couple of times, digital preservation, because a lot of people immediately say digital archiving, but to avoid any confusion, the terminology that you'll find in the marketplace is digital preservation. So also the international organization that works around the topic is the Digital Preservation Coalition. To make it clear that one of the aims of a digital archiving solution is really preserving the information for years to come. And if we're thinking about digital preservation, there are several challenges, and these are possibly the most important ones. So if you're working with digital information, the 4 main challenges are authenticity. How are you going to authenticate a digital object? The provenance, where does it come from? The integrity of the objects, and the context. These are the 4 main challenges. And that's the case whether we're talking about digital contracts, digitally signed contracts, research information, digital images, cultural heritage. In every case, these are the main challenges. So the first one, authenticity, has to respond to the question, is something what it claims to be? Okay. Mainly that's evidence-based. So what does the metadata say about this object? Is this object what it claims to be? And for example, the borrowed image, if it would claim to be an image that was taken in Ukraine a couple of years ago, that would not be an authentic statement. But if it says it's an image from the borrowed picture that claims, that proves the authenticity. Also, with authenticity, one of the important steps there is signature validation. Can we validate the signature? Is this a validly signed document? Provenance. Where does the information come from and how was it created? How was it kept, maintained during its lifetime? And it's not just the origin, because in a lot of cases we think about origin or originality. Is this the original format? But that's something which is easy to state in an analog world, because of a physical object, there's only one version. Of a digital object, that's more complicated, because digital objects in a digital world, a copy of the original is also the original. A copy doesn't really exist. So, but with origin, it's important, where does it come from? Who created this? At what time? It's not about the technical information. How was this created, with which client, and what formats? That's not the case. So you have to also keep the information of about the chain of ownership, who are the different people who intervened with regard to this information, and the chronology of events. Important there is the format conversions, because when you preserve a digital object, once every few years, you have to convert it to a different format. And you also need to keep a trace of the information. So I've already said it, it's important to have the trace, the audit trail, on all the events and actions that happened on the information or the document during its lifetime, but also during the preservation. Workflow information is also an important one. Think about financial transactions, or a new law that has been passed. It's important to have an idea about the context, how it came to be publicly available, what made this law take effect. Okay. Integrity. So integrity is related to, can we prove that the information has not been altered, has not been falsified? That's of course a bit more technical, but what are the different actions that you will take is, for example, create information about fixity, which is stored within the metadata. And generally you have to think about a hash or a checksum that is created, but which can be complemented with a digital seal. Or a certificate which is embedded in the documents that shows you that the document has not been altered. It's important to understand that a lot of people think that you should convert everything to PDF and that cannot be changed. That's not the case. So PDF or PDFA can always be modified very simply, even on a Mac. In preview, you can change any PDF document that you want to change. But if you want to have the information unaltered within your system, you can also create a sealed document version of that document. Okay. Security, or only authorized people allowed to see the documents or to modify a document. A write blocker, you can have a system in place that simply disables all modifications on the file system of any file. And initially, and that's best to do at the beginning, at the ingest, the moment that you put something in the archive, to perform a virus scan to make sure that you don't put any corruptions into your archive. Okay. Context. And this is maybe one of the most important ones in the digital archive. You have to make sure that the information can be interpreted, visualized, read, and understood by your users. Okay. It's something which is often overlooked, but it makes no sense to archive information if you're unable to open it in 10, 20, 30 years. It's one of the most important concepts. In the past, we did a project for one of the biggest construction companies in the country, and they lost a court case in the Netherlands. It was a tunnel that started leaking, and they were unable to open the documents related to the construction of that tunnel. So they had to at their own expense meant all the issues involved with the tunnel. Okay. So if you talk about context, there are different types. Of course, we think about metadata, and that metadata, the information about the objects should contain at least the following information. So first of all, technical information which is typically related to the format of the objects, but also things like file size and the hash. Utilization, which is quite important. So utilization is about your user community. What formats and what information do users need to be able to open and understand the information? Intellectual. So what is the context that we need about this object to understand where it comes from and how it was used in the past and how it's going to be used in the future? And authentication, so the evidence that we create about the origin and the provenance of the documents to make sure that it's an authentic file. Okay. So this is with regard to the context, but of course, one of the main challenges, as everybody knows, with regard to preservation is the hardware obsolence. The file systems degrade over the years. We have concepts like bit rot that make files unusable over the years. Next to that, we have the different file types. So we've already mentioned PDF, but you have about any file type that can go into your archive. And these also need to be changed over time, and you have to make sure that they don't become obsolete. People don't tend to use WordPerfect anymore, but that's one of the file formats. If you look at archive systems, there's still plenty of WordPerfect files out there. Works, for those who remember Works, but it's a kind of formats that you see still being present on different file systems. And then of course there's the challenge of the digital signature. How are we going to make sure that our digitally signed documents keep their validity over the years? And of course the context is also something that changes over the years. The business context changes, the products that you have in your company, in your organization change, the processes change. So the context of your archive is also subject to change. Okay. So what isn't digital preservation? Simply having backups of your solution is not digital preservation, because it doesn't guarantee you in any way to be able to open information in years to come. Same thing for worm. Okay, with a worm, you're sure that the information can't be altered, but that's also one of the negative consequences if you need to convert information and adapt it to a new context. A legal archive is also not a digital preservation system. On several different websites or several different companies publicly claim to have a legal archive that can be used for all types of context. But in most cases, legal archive, especially in a Belgian context, is simply used to store invoices, which is a more limited functionality. Converting everything to PDFA is also not an archive. Although the terminology, the A stands for archive, PDF archive, but in fact, it's not something that you should be using in every case in an archiving solution. Simply think about Excel, the Excel format. If you convert Excel workbooks to PDF, you lose a lot of the functionality of the PDF document, of the Excel documents. You lose all the macros, all the calculations, and logically, it's not the best of formats for archiving information, or same thing for images or CAD drawings. Okay. In digital preservation, it's also important to avoid risks. So anything that can introduce a risk within your archive should also be avoided. Things like compression, because IT will often say we'll have to compress all the information to reduce the disk space. But of course, if you're going to decompress, that immediately introduces a risk, because you're never sure that the file will be decompressed correctly. Encryption is also to be avoided in a lot of cases, because the same thing, at a certain point in time, you have to decrypt. And also you have to avoid specific system dependence. because you can never foresee when a provider or a vendor would stop the, for example, let's say we have a solution that depends 100% on an Oracle database. It's, of course, although it might be strange, but it's not impossible that an Oracle database will no longer be there in 20 years. Okay. Also, when looking at information archiving, it should always be possible to archive any type of information, so regardless of the form. In a lot of cases, archive solutions will be purely document archives, but that's one of the reasons is that in the past, a lot of document management systems were used to create an archiving solution. Think about the typical Documentum or Alfresco or other solutions. In a lot of cases, those solutions were used to build a digital archive on top. Also, the documents as a container is clearly, but slowly disappearing. Okay, in a lot of cases, there's simply no need to put information in a document container. It's a form factor that we know from the past. It's not going to go away very fast, of course not, because digital signing, for one, is just being introduced, to put like that, in the markets, and in most cases we sign documents. But next to that, the importance of video and digital images cannot be underestimated. When people said 10 years ago video will be the next or the most important format on the internet, a lot of people wouldn't believe it, but these days I don't think anybody will negate that. And next to that, also, there's a lot of data that needs to be archived on process information, but also on transactions. Okay. And if you look at a document management system versus the digital archive, those are clearly two different solutions. The one doesn't, the digital archive or digital preservation solution doesn't replace the document management solution, and vice versa. But they have two clearly distinct goals, two different finalities. A document management system is used to create and manage documents, and an archive is aimed at preserving information. In document management, there are no or nearly no standards, which makes us the ideal solution for consults. But for a digital archive, there are different international standards. So it's quite binary. Okay, it's an archiving solution or not. And of course, you can have different functionalities on top, which are not standard within that standard, to extend the use cases of that solution. But at the base, it's binary. The information type in a document management system is unstructured. In most cases, it's a document with metadata linked to it. In a digital archive, it's unstructured, and the package, as said, it's an information package that you're going to store, which can contain either data or objects, and can contain both. Okay, so two different types of systems, but in a lot of cases, and also it's easiest in most cases to keep them as two separate systems, not try and build the one fantastic monster that does everything. Because you also have to be aware that a document management system or a business process management system, line of business application, it has to change with the business. It has to support the new business processes. An archive is different with regard to that. If you're preserving information and you want to keep that archive as stable as possible over years and over years to come. Okay.
Doesn't that mean that there will be two forms of documents, one in the document management system and the other one? Or is that one document that will be in both systems, or how do you solve that problem?
Yeah, how do you solve that problem? That was one of the
questions, yeah,
of the subjects of the next session as well. So there's different types of things that you can do. You could, because you have to archive information that needs to be retained as quickly as possible within the process. So meaning you could archive immediately. Let's say it's customer communication, incoming communication. You are going to archive it, consult it from a different solution. Other way around is you could simply store it, let's say in your document management solution, and from there immediately archive it. And then you have different options. You can see it as a stub, so a pointer to the archive, But when you're going to create that pointer, when you're going to do that in a point, at which point in time you're going to do that, that's up to you, that's up to the business. You could do that immediately at the end of the operational preservation, or maybe in, let's say, a specific point in time in the future. Okay.
Thank you.
So, and I said, in a lot of cases, we've seen in the past that a document management solution was used to store or archive the information. But if you look at a lot of, typically the context of customer documents, so incoming customer documents, let's say a signed contract, and outgoing communication sent to the customers, in most cases, that's information that should go to an archive. And you have an archive solution linked to your outbound or your customer communication system. And instead of having a document management system linked to that one. Okay. So, and of course, as it goes with these types of solutions, there are different international standards. And the first one, and maybe the best known one, comes from the space agencies, from NASA. Because if you look at the space industry, they are the ones that have had digital information for the longest period of time. So if you just look at Voyager 1, for example, Voyager 1 has been launched in 1977. But these days, that information is still actively consulted and also have to be preserved for years to come. So that's almost 50 years since the launch of Voyager 1. And with regard to that, NASA created a standard on how to preserve digital information so you can keep access to it and it can still be read and interpreted. Okay. And that concept was introduced as the Open Archival Information System, the OIS standard. And that introduced the concept of the Trustworthy Repository. So Trustworthy Repository, something which is stored in such a repository, can be trusted as being authentic and a version of the truth. Okay. And that standard is the ISO 14721. And it can be certified in the ISO 16363. In short, what does it do? So you see the element in gray is what the archiving solution looks like, or the functionalities that have to be provided by the archive. On the left-hand side, you have the producer, the producing application. That can be a document management system, that can be an ERP, a line of business application, a scan solution, a digital signing platform. It produces information, and that information creates a SIP, a package that contains metadata, the objects that need to be archived, and those are ingested in the archive. There different actions take place, like, for example, a virus scan, checking the file, creating fixity information. So that happens during ingest. And then based on that, the archiving information package is created. So data goes to the data management system, objects go to the archival storage. Okay. And then on top, we see preservation planning. And preservation planning are the actions that you need to take in order to technology-wise maintain the information in your solution. So to maintain the solution itself and to maintain the different formats within your application. The administration does everything with relation to the retention periods. And then we have the access control on the solution. And the access control is also linked to the consumer group. So the users of your solution that are going to access the information from your archive, but maybe in a different format and with different data than the one that is stored in your archive. Okay, and that's the concept of the Trustworthy Repository. The OIS standard is pretty well documented, but for archivists, it's something which is really inked on their arms. If you're talking to an archivist who bears the title with any pride, to put it like that, because there are archivists who don't know the standard. But any archivist, if he's going to talk to you about a solution for digital archiving, within 5 minutes, he's going to ask you questions related to the OIS standard to verify whether your solution complies to the OIS standard. So there are typical questions like, for example, what happens in case of calamity? How can I access the information? Is the information encrypted? Stuff like that. So that's the types of questions that an archivist is going to ask. This is something that I've taken from a website of a vendor who sells an archiving solution. And you'll find different vendors out there who are going to state things like these. It's a standard-based repository that complies with Open Archival Information System and ISO 14721. So first of all, it complies twice to the same thing. But secondly, and that's quite important to know, is that the OIS standard is not a standard that describes a technical solution. It describes an environment. It describes an archiving environment, and everything can pretty well be done manually. So this is a false statement. There is no solution available on the market that complies with the. You can create a solution with that standard in mind, but in the end, it's the, let's say, it's the customer environment that is certified. Okay. Because within the context of the OIS norm, let's say, for example, you need to have technology watch and to convert documents every few years, but that can very well be somebody who verifies your entire archive manually and manually converts those files every few times. Okay. So, but before before you all get frightened with regard to the subjects, in the end, what can it look like, such an archiving solution? It can look like something very simple that we all know. In the end, it can look like a document management system, but with a few extras in here, of course. As you'll see, you have a browser tree, but what's different in an archive is that the browser tree normally is built automatically based on the information which is ingested in the archive. You also representation on the right-hand side, because any object can have different representations, different formats, and the sub-packages, you can have different packages in there. As said, it's not about the document, it's about the packages. And on top, you'll see different reports that have run on the objects, the permissions, and the history. If you have a look at basically a document that has been put in the system, you'll also see that there are different metadata schemes. Premise is one of the best known ones, but the information asset, as the context can evolve over time, you can also have different metadata schemes in there. And what you'll see here as well is the format validation, is the document or the format what it claims to be. And then, different types of information that go with it. Okay. So that was with regard to the standards. If you look at regulations, and that's maybe the most interesting part, there are different regulations. And if you think regulations, we think Europe. Okay. And what did Europe want to do with the with one of the regulations, or with several of the regulations? Europe wants to create trusts in a digital future. And also Europe wants to push all organizations, and to be honest, that's mainly finance and insurance, to become more digital, to work more digitally than they did before. But of course, for that, you need to have trust in the digital economy. And one of the things that we know best is, of course, signing documents digitally, so with the eID. And therefore, the eIDAS regulation was implemented. eIDAS, that stands for Electronic Identification, Authentication, and Trust Services. So which is the regulation that saw the light in 2014. And the main goal there was to create trust in the digital identity and signature, and a definition of several trust services. And if you look at the trust services, these are incomplete, but of course, we all know qualified signature. One of the other ones is qualified preservation of qualified e-signatures. Okay. Europe also clearly defined how do you need to preserve those digital signatures. Okay, so the goal of eIDAS eIDAS is the non-discrimination, to give the same legal value to digitally signed documents or digital documents, the same value as the paper alternatives. And with the qualified trust services, so you have trust services, like for example, for signing or preservation, but next to the standard services, which we call advanced in most cases, you have qualified trust services that are provided by a qualified trust service provider. And those also offer non-repudiation. So there's no need to prove the integrity and authenticity of those documents if they are stored by a qualified trust service provider. And it also provides reversal of burden of proof. Okay. So when do you become qualified? Okay. So there's technology that's at work. And when you need to be certified or as a qualified trust service provider, they are first going to look at the technology. Does the technology do what it claims to do? Okay. So of course you need to have a solution, for example, a solution for signing. And in some cases, Europe even provides those building blocks to put a service in place. Okay. So the technology part of things. Then on the next level, you have the procedures. So the contracts, the terms and conditions, how are you going to ingest? How is this solution implemented? So the procedures around your technology. And lastly, you have the organization. They are also going to look at the organization. How is the organization stable? Do they have sufficient people to maintain the solution? Things like that. So can you have trust in that organization? Are they trustworthy? Okay. But next to that, so that's all fine and very nice. So Europe provided the framework for digitally signing documents and preserving digital signatures. But there's a big issue related to the version 1. So because when you digitally sign documents, the certificate expires after a certain period of time. Every certificate expires. So every digital signature expires. If you look, for example, at your eID, your Belgian eID, in most cases, it only has a validity of 5 years. So that's one thing. But what if the document needs to be converted? So you have a PDF document, which is digitally signed, and you need to convert it to a different format. What happens with the signature? And next to that, of course, Moore's principle or Moore's law is also still at work. Because current signing methods will become insecure. Some say within 10 years. I've spoken to someone last 2 weeks ago, and he claimed that it would be in less than a year, in 2023, because he firmly believes that quantum computing will be readily available as of 2023. And next to that, of course, the issue that has been created with the eIDAS v1 is that it only covers the preservation of signatures, not of documents. They clearly say eArchiving in the v1 is out of scope, but all, or let's say at least 90% of all digital signatures are embedded within a document. So they are not just stored as digital signatures. So that, which makes it harder because they don't clearly state how you need to do that. Okay. And therefore my apologies, but this one is in Dutch. Therefore, the Belgian lawmaker decided to implement or to create the Digital Act that is explaining how you should archive your digital documents and your digitally signed documents. So that the Belgian Digital Act, which is the law of July 21st, 2016. And what was the main goal? It was clearly that in Belgium, they said, look, with eIDAS, we are going to transpose eIDAS to a local law, but there's a gap in there. So what should we do with the digitally signed documents? And with the Digital Act, that's what they wanted to cover. First of all, the digitally signed documents, but then also, why not extend it to all documents that have a legal retention period, okay? And those are defined within the Digital Act. There are two main parts in the Digital Act. First of all, there's two certification schemas. If you look at the certification schema of the Digital Act, so the Appendix A covers everything with regard to eArchiving services for long-term preservation. And all digital born documents with legal retention should be archived in such a solution. Okay. And next to that, you have the archiving service for digitization, think scanning. That's basically purely scanning. So how do you need to scan documents? So you can destroy the paper originals and give the same legal validity to the digital alternative. But keep in mind, once that they are scanned in a qualified way, they also need to be preserved in a qualified way. Okay. Okay. So the Digital Act, and there's one thing which is foreseen in the Digital Act for qualified archiving. There's an obligation foreseen for all digital documents that have a retention period to store them or to archive them qualifiedly. So typically, you need to think of the documents that these days you also need to archive properly. Things like fiscal information, financial information, HR documents, etc. So those types of documents need to be archived properly, so in a qualified way. That obligation has already been expressed, for example, for HR documents. So all the information that, so your employment contracts, and all the information that goes with it, like medical information or other, okay? The certification scheme in itself, what does it look like? So there's the ETSI 319401, and that one explains where you have to comply to, or with what you have to comply as a qualified trust service provider. So that looks at the organization. You can think of it, it's very similar to the ISO 27001, okay? Then we have the ISO 14641, and that one describes how you should preserve your digital documents. And the ISO 14741 is mentioned here because that's the one which is being used in the certification schema. And why not the 14721? Because this one describes how your IT solution should look like. It describes the technological solution. And that's a very big difference with the 14721. When you want to become a qualified provider of eArchiving services, your solution has to correspond to this, okay? As said, it's binary. Then you have the two ETSIs, the 511 and the 512. So the 511 describes how you need to preserve digital signatures, and the 512 describes the proper protocols that you have to implement, think web services, okay? So if you comply with these, you can become a qualified trust service provider for eArchiving. So external service providers, let's say as Dogbite, we want to provide a service to other companies, then we need to be recertified every 2 years. If you're looking at implementing such a solution for internal purposes, it's every 3 years, okay? But what have we seen? First of all, what have we seen with the Digital Act? It took a very long time before the certification schema was available. So the Digital Act was published in 2016. The certification schema only in March last year. So that took them almost 5 years. eIDAS became active in 2016. So there was also a revision of eIDAS after 5 years. And that was mainly due to COVID, because what they saw in the market was that although one should expect that COVID pushed a lot of people to digital signing and digital sealing of documents and working in a more digital way, for typical contracts, a lot of contracts, mainly in finance and insurance, still remained on paper. And that was mainly due to the gap in the eIDAS regulation. So what's going to happen with the what happened in 2021? There was a revision, a review of eIDAS published with a focus on two things mainly. So extending qualified eArchiving to the EU. So having a level playing field with regard to digital archiving, and to do away with the gap for digitally signed documents, and to implement the digital wallet. Something most of the people in Belgium will have heard about, because of the Secretary of Digitization, Mathieu Michel, this is one of the topics on which he's very fervent. Okay. What's the expectation with regard to the review of eIDAS? The expectation that's going to be voted at the end of 2022 or in the course of 2023, and that's going to be implemented normally, if all goes well, in 2023. Okay. So why archiving? Why should you be doing this? So first of all, for the business to prevent a loss of critical records and contracts, it's the aspect of business continuity to make sure that that you have maybe somewhere in the cloud or on another location a digital archiving solution that keeps all your documents and information safe, that guarantees you can consider it as a bit of a DRP. Also for statistical purposes, it might be interesting to have the whole lot of documents in one place. Then, of course, legal compliance, as said, documents for which you have a retention period. Also limitation of liability. Make sure at the end of the retention periods that the information is also purged from the system. GDPR, it hasn't been mentioned before, but GDPR is here again. In GDPR, you have also the obligation to demonstrate that the retention periods are respected. And then, of course, for IT, cost reduction. And cost reduction, how can we do that? Because as said, in a proper archiving solution, you also should be able to archive the data from applications. Think about, for example, ERP systems. In a lot of companies, they have different ERP systems that have grown over the years, to put it like that, or old versions of CRMs. And a customer, for example, he wants to move to SAP HANA. Instead of embarking on an expensive migration project, it's also possible to archive the old information within the system without any data loss. So application decommissioning is typically one of the use cases for which an archiving solution can be used, in which you can archive information that comes from different source solutions. For one of our customers, for example, that's something that we did a couple of years ago. And this is a healthcare provider, so it's a hospital. And in a hospital, this is something which is not so uncommon. Why? Because you have medical imaging solutions, think CT scan, X-rays, and those solutions are replaced every few years. In the past, they often chose to migrate that information from one system to the new system, but those operations cost millions of euros. Nowadays, it should be more common to archive that information and to access it from the new solution. And this works not only for medical imaging, but for all types of document management systems where you can offload the information. So also for performance reasons. So that's application decommissioning. And then, think of something like this, where you have a source system where you can do the mapping on the target system. You create a zip package that is being archived and sent to the archive. And this can work as a continuous process. Okay. So that's the end of my part. Any questions?
Any questions from the audience? There were none in the chat, but Steve, yeah.
Yeah, apologies for not using the chat. I just came across when I saw your presentation. In the past, I've always had challenges with archiving because of the cost compared to the savings that we would have on the platforms, especially on SAP, because the savings that you see are on disk space, which is not expensive. The performance, which sometimes is a bottleneck, you can get rid of records. But overall, we've never really had good business cases to justify an archiving project. Are these projects still in, I don't know about the price range today, is that now changing to be more cost efficient, or is it still quite a difficult business case to defend?
No, it's that's the biggest thing that has changed there, of course, is that the pricing is quite different, and it's also something which is rather volume based, almost directly linked to the storage space that is being used.
Yeah,
it's also, if you look at the value, the added value mainly for ERP systems is also higher because in most cases, or 80% of the information which is being archived is data. So the volume is also quite limited.
Yeah, so but the volume of archiving is limited, but so is the volume of savings. That was always the challenge. I think with images, it could be maybe more interesting. Okay, but do you have like this archiving? I mean, these archiving projects, is there like a payback period that you say this is what you typically see and this is the minimum amount you need to look at or think about?
Yeah, but of course that healthcare example is maybe a bad one, because there the ROI, I think it was realized in a month or in 2 months.
Yeah.
So that's maybe not the best of examples, but I can always give you some information about what the costs are. For example, of I can pass you the information, but I prefer not to do this on the on public chat. So of an ERP archiving project that we did and what it cost them.
Yeah. Okay. I'm actually not involved anymore with ERP. It was just that back then that was the biggest challenge we had in those cases. Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Actually, we did a survey for the participants what the biggest drivers for e-archiving were in their company, and reducing cost was not the top priority. Actually, it was more regulations, compliance, etc., as well as getting rid of legacy applications. So application decommissioning, as you mentioned, of course. So I think cost is of course very important, but in many cases it is not the top reason. Is that also your impression, Frederick?
Yeah, but application decommissioning is of course cost driven. It's reducing the cost of your total TCO. But the one thing that surprises me, or that has been surprising me over the last couple of months, is that application decommissioning is something that a lot of companies are unaware about. They simply don't think that it's something or a viable option or something which is possible. That's something that has surprised us quite a few times over the last few months. Because in a lot of organizations, they keep legacy systems live just to for compliance reasons, to have access to the information.
I come from the HR sector, and there are a lot of SAP HR systems which are just there because they still need to report on it, but they've already moved on to the next system. It's just that the business case to make is indeed you need to, what's the user experience of the archived solution, and that's difficult to explain sometimes if you're not really if you don't not talking to the right people, and people can't imagine switching technology for an old thing. To do an investment for an old thing to switch, it's need to talk to the right people. So if you want to get their attention, you need to work via cost, because they do listen to that. And that's then sometimes the problem. It's a bit difficult. Okay.
Any questions from the banking or insurance participants in the room? Or from the person from It's Me? Rudolf, a question: is eIDAS preservation related with eIDAS delivery services?
That's a good one. So, but yeah, you have the eIDAS preservation, but I said eArchiving was not part in the current eIDAS. That's coming in the new one. So the eArchiving delivery service. So you have a registered delivery. So of the and in normally it's not related because you can perfectly have a registered email which is not linked to preservation, but I think it's something you can link the two of them, because that way you can also demonstrate what has been sent to a user, because he can still consult a copy. And then you have the other delivery services of information, but that's something for me which is also a bit linked to the single digital gateway. So secure delivery of information, because in the single digital gateway, what will happen is that it's already there, but normally it should become an obligation in 2023. And that means that all information linked to live events or, for example, insurance documents should be interchangeable between different countries. So if you go, for example, to Portugal and you need a birth certificate and your conformity document of your car, for example, that you can present that in a digital way. That means that the other information needs to be stored in a normalized way with the same metadata by every member state and by every, let's say, bank and insurance or public administration in the same method, with the same types of metadata, with the same protocols that can be presented. And that's something which is also going to impact preservation and delivery services.
Okay. I'd like to break here for 5 minutes, get a glass of water, get away from the screen and get back in 5 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. Second part is more on how to do it, a bit more technical. Nevertheless, you will be able to follow this step because it's a step-by-step approach, a very detailed, structured approach to how to do it, presented by Michiel van Driessen of Dogbite. Floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Yeah, as Frederick said, for the more technical stuff that no one can understand, I'll try to make it not too deep technical. And as Patrick said, go through it step by step. So when we're setting up an archive, what do we need to think about? Frederick already mentioned a few things, and then how are we going to archive a document? I state document here, but as Frederick already mentioned as well, archiving goes a lot deeper than documents, and we'll have a small discussion on that as well. So what to think about? Well, 3 main pillars of archiving solutions: accessibility, integrity, and preservation. So accessibility is really on, okay, can I find my information? Can I read the information over time? Also the context of that information. Integrity, of course, does it stay the same? Can I prove that it all stayed the same? And preservation, of course, yeah, think about all of that. But if we're building an archive, that's not for today that we're doing it, but it's for 10, 20, 30, 45, 50 years, as Frederick mentioned. There's even stuff of hundreds of years, some historical archives we never want to lose, of course. So how do we already think about those things nowadays? Well, first of all, Frederick mentioned it as well. Metadata is very, very important. It helps you to find your content, but it also helps you describe the context of an object. The context, for instance, it's important to have that context if you have your archiving building plans. It's not always the case that the address of a plan is on the document itself. If you then do not have the context of where is this coming from, what is the location of this building, then there's a lot of information that you're losing, and maybe even the whole need for keeping that document is lost. So different than most people think about metadata when we're looking at document management systems, where we want to keep it as simple as possible, not to put too much burden on the user. For an archiving solution, we're actually looking into collecting as much metadata as possible. Not only the metadata that is available from the source system, but for instance, also metadata that is available within the document. If we're thinking about Word documents, there's a lot of information inside a Word document that most people never see. There's information on everyone that worked on that document. That's all context information, metadata that can be important and that can be interesting if we move to another document type, because that information might get lost. There's several types of metadata. There's descriptive metadata, that's metadata specifically for preservation, specifically for access control. There's lots of different things. And there's also lots of different initiatives around the world to create metadata schemes. There's Dublin Core Metadata Initiative, which is well known within the archiving community. There's EAD. And then in, for instance, the Netherlands, there's MDTO, where actually the government is creating a metadata schema, and making it so that everyone, especially the government, needs to follow that metadata schema in order for it to make it easier to, as Frederick already said, interchange those items with other governments in instances. And there's premise. Premise is really a metadata schema created specifically to keep all that information around preservation. What happened with an object, at what point was it converted into another type, and those kind of things. And of course, you can have also your own metadata schemas if you don't find anything that allows you to put the data that you have. Second part to look into is readability. Of course, there's no use in storing and keeping documents, keeping files, if we can no longer read them in X amount of years. So Frederick already mentioned format obsolence. Formats change, and it's things that we need to think about, especially if we're thinking about having an archive for the coming years, 50s of years. So how can we tackle that? Well, first of all, we need to make sure that we know what it is inside our archive. We're going to identify the formats. We're going to say, okay, something arrives here. Let's have a look at what this is, not at what it claims to be, because there's a lot of people that think, oh, I have a Word document. Someone is asking me, I need to have it in a PDF. So we change the extension to .pdf and Bob's your uncle. No, we are going to identify, okay, what type of document is it? What tools were used to create this? What tools were used to view this? And then we can have something what's called a technology watch that sees, okay, these type of documents, these formats, can we still use these? Are we expecting any issues with them? Are we expecting them to fade away? Or are we expecting them to stay at the moment? And that's not something that you can decide today for your whole archive for the next years. That's something that needs to be done on a regular basis. And of course, it's a lot better and easier than to choose for open formats. Archiving solutions try to choose for open formats. Why? Well, even if the vendor of the application no longer supports that format, there's a full description available. And actually, some of the standards even specify that you should archive that description as well on how you need to open that document, how you need to interpret the information of that file. But of course, it's not always an option to go for an open format, and that's okay if you have, if you are sure that it's a supported format. For instance, there are vendors who are saying, okay, we know our formats are very difficult to read. It's proprietary, so we're not going to give you the full description, but we are guaranteeing to you that in the next 5 versions of our software, we are still going to support this. So you are certain that for a period of time, you can keep that format. Of course, what we need to do then, if we identify a format that's no longer readable or that we identify as a risk, then there is something called format preservation. And that can be done in 2 ways. You can say, okay, I'm going to transform into a new format. And there, of course, Word to PDF comes to mind as one of the easiest ones. But there's also the part of emulating. Emulating, we all know emulation probably more from setting up a DOSBox environment to play an old game that we had. Well, that's also a way of archiving old games and to make sure that you can still read that old data object. So you can decide that now for the formats coming into your archive, but you can also have some point in the future where you say, okay, we need to reevaluate because there's 2 options. The rendition format that we chose is no longer supported and we need to move away from it. Or actually, the original format is still supported although we expected it not to be, and we can still work with that one. And at that point in time, you can make, again, the new decision to say, okay, with our original document or our first rendition that we created, we can go into the emulation way or think that, okay, for the next 5 years, it will still be supported, or we can transform into another format which might not have been known yet. The important thing for an archive is to prepare for these changes. It's not to have a clear fixed way of what your document should do, but your archive should allow you to make those decisions. As Frederick said, it's also very dependent on your use case of your format, what decision you will need to make. Excel files are not the same to handle as Word files. Keeping our documents, there's the concept called bit rot. It's been around a lot longer than we think, because basically it just says everything fades away. Even a stone will fade away over time to create a gigantic canyon. It's just a matter of time. So what do we need to do to prepare for the fact that we won't lose our information? Well, of course, we need to choose for a stable solid storage solution, but we also need to make sure that we regularly refresh our storage. Don't think, okay, we'll put this on a NAS with 3 disks, and that will always keep going because our 3 disks will stay there. No, those will fail as well after time, so they need to be refreshed after from a normal at a certain point in time. The good things about living in the world that we do now is, of course, we have cloud providers, and those cloud storage providers give us a lot of solutions where they tackle these issues, where they have people or machines regularly switching those disks so that we can be sure at, I think Amazon sits around 12 nines of availability of your documents at this moment, well, so that we can make sure that we won't lose that data. Next to that, it's also important to track and validate that we didn't have any issues with that. So that can be done with hashing. Simply, we have a hash of our document. We store that next to the document so that we can make sure that it was not changed over time. We also need a proof of existence of our documents, of our data. Well, the basic proof of existence is, of course, you can still have your archiving solution provide you with the time it was archived and it was hashed. And that can be enough for you. It can be enough for internal use. But of course, for legal reasons, we will need more. And for that, that's what they have timestamps for. So you can have an advanced timestamp or a fully qualified timestamp if you need qualified proof of existence. Proof of validity, yeah. Documents coming into our archive can contain signatures. Well, signatures are not valid as long as you think they might be. Signatures expire based on the certificates that are used for it, based on the services that are used for it. But I can tell you, if you go and sign a document with your eID today, you can then go to the police and say, well, I lost my eID. From that moment on, the certificate is no longer valid, which means the signature you created just before that also is no longer valid unless it contains proof of validity. That can be done inside signatures. That's tackled with timestamping most of the time, with adding a timestamp, so a long-term validation signature. But in an archive, we even go a step further, because also those timestamps will fade over time, so will expire. So in an archive, you can gather the proof that a signature is valid and timestamp that next to the document and keep that timestamp active and re-timestamp it over time. And that's why they have timestamp archiving timestamps, because also timestamps can expire. The archiving timestamp is described in RFC 4998 and 6283. It depends on what format you want. But basically what it says is, okay, we have some documents, some metadata, some maybe the proof of our signature, some other documents. Instead of creating one timestamp for each and every one of those, we are going to create the hashes of those documents, of that data, and we are going to combine them together. So we combine them in a tree structure by combining hash 1 and A and B, hash B, C and D. We regenerate hashes, we combine those again, and we regenerate that hash. At that moment, you have a hash that can actually, keeping some of the information of building that tree structure, that can prove the existence and the fact that all that data hasn't changed. If we timestamp that, we're good for now. Of course, again, that timestamp can expire. So what can be done is at a regular interval, we just rehash that timestamp and re-timestamp so that we can prove that that was all valid. That's necessary for expiration of timestamps certificates, but it's also necessary for expiration of hashing algorithms. As Frederick mentioned, between 1 and 10 years from now, all hashing algorithms that we know will be invalid. They will be breakable, so we will need to redo that hashing and re-timestamp in time before those are breakable. So that's where preservation comes in place. We need to prepare for all the changes. We need to regularly review everything in the archive, all the content, but not only the content, also the solution. It is possible that in 5, 10, 20 years from now, the solution that you have chosen might not be the good one anymore for your archive. So you need to prepare also for migrating to another archive. One of the things to look at, of course, during those changes, what we mentioned already, is that technology watch, especially on file formats that you've been using, hashing algorithm that has been used, and those kind of things. So knowing what is inside the archive is one of the most important things. Formats, hashing algorithms, and the use of open standards or standards with a guarantee, so that you know that they are solid to be used for the coming years, both for file format, metadata, and storage formats. And yeah, I was going to mention that PDFA is not the best solution there is, and Frederick actually created an article about it, but he has spoken so much about it already that I'm not going to give a lot of extra attention on it. But if you want to know more about it, there's a LinkedIn blog post that you can read. So how are we going to archive a document? Well, let's first think on what actually is a document that we want to put in our archive, or because a document is more than a file. In a technology world, in a digital world, documents and files are used interchangeably quite a lot, but it's not the same thing. Think about a document that you have on paper, 10 pages, and you put them in a scanner, and your scanner scans them to JPEG images. Well, then you have 10 JPEG files, but in the end of the day, your document is the combination of those 10 files. Same thing with digitally signing documents. Those signatures can be embedded in the document, but you can also have a detached signature. Well, at that moment, your document that you want to keep is not only that file, but also the detached signature. So the document at the end of the day is a combination. Also representations, you can have a Word document and a PDF document, a PDF generated from that Word document. They are the exact same document, just in another representation. So how are we going to tackle all of that? Well, that's where OIS created the description for an information package. So an information package is going to combine our representations, all our files in those representations, and all the metadata around it. Metadata about content, about fixity, about provenance, everything that is necessary to be kept inside our package. How to archive a document? Well, that's where this image comes back into place. So the image is about the OIS, is from the OIS standard, as Frederick explains, and it goes through a few different steps. We have our submission information package arriving. It's been ingested and converted into an archival information package, and a consumer can request what that's then is called a dissemination information package. So let's have a look at that first step. Ingest, and then of course storing it in the archival storage. So for ingest, first things to do are a few checks. Virus check, because of course we don't want to put a virus in our archive. Readability checks. Can we read the content that is being sent? Because it doesn't mean that if someone sends you a document, that document hasn't gone broken in transfer, or they just send you something with some metadata next to it claiming, well, this is documents containing this. If you do not check that at the moment that it comes into the archive, you have no way to prove that it actually was still the same. It's actually what you have received, and you never received the correct data. And format validations, checking, okay, which format is this and what can we do with it? Second part of all of that is enhancements. We're going to take that zip package and make it into an archival information package. So we are going to do some extra steps. For instance, extract that metadata. If it's a Word file coming in, well, let's extract as much data as we can that describes the document. Possibly doing some format transformations based on rules we have defined for our archive, creating all those hashes, calculating all those hashes that we need, doing signature validations. As we said, we want to make sure that everything coming into the archive is valid, validating that signature, and timestamping everything that we have created as proof, so that we have the proof of, well, everything that came into the archive, it was readable, signatures were valid, these were the hashes, and it came in at that point, so we have the full proof of everything in there. Signatures were valid. It doesn't mean that if a signature is invalid, we cannot store it into the archive. But we will keep into the metadata, we will keep the fact that, well, the signature that arrived into the archive was not valid at that point. Archival storage, so once we have created a whole package, we of course need to store it. As said, we go for a stable storage solution. It can be a cloud object storage, it can be a NAS, a worm storage, everything you can imagine. There's enough security rules to implement on almost every sort of storage device, as long as it's not a simple USB stick. But the most important thing for your archival storage is the way you are going to store your packages on there. You need an understandable structure, and it needs to be reconstructible. Why? Well, at that moment, your whole solution can be gone. You are still able to read the packages from the storage itself. So we have here, for instance, an example structure of our information package where we have some folders with metadata in there, descriptive metadata, preservation metadata. We also have a folder for the different representations, and we see, okay, there are 2 representations in there. They have their own metadata as well, and they have their data files in there. If, as said, we need to think about, okay, we need to be able to migrate to another storage, to another archiving solution. If this archiving solutions that we have chosen today no longer works, well, if they implement the same standard on a storage base, you can just take the storage from one solution, put it on the other one. Under the other one, it will probably need some indexing, but at that moment, your migration is done. Thinking about preservation planning, as said, there's a few things to do. Of course, a lot of that preservation planning stuff needs to happen semi-manually. There needs to be someone saying, okay, I'm going to validate. There's no good way to say, okay, there is a format, it's no longer usable, let's go transform it. That needs to be the job of an archivist saying, okay, we are currently using these formats, they are no longer good, we are going to transform that. So for that, of course, it's important to have an overview of what is inside the archive, a format overview. And we can also, from a preservation planning perspective, do some validation actions, validating the signatures that were in the archive, revalidating them, validating the timestamps that we have in the archive, validating those hashes that we have created, all that fixity information. That's more maintenance of the archive. It's really looking into, okay, is everything that we have in here still correct? If there is something that needs to be done, so for instance, our timestamp validation notices, well, most of our timestamps or some of our timestamps are going to expire in the next months. Well, then we go to the enhanced part of the preservation planning, where we can, of course, say, okay, let's do an update of these timestamps. Let's update some hashes. For instance, if the hashing algorithm that we used is no longer valid, or let's do some format transformations. We've decided to move certain files to a new format. Consulting parts, of course, we also need to read from the archive. We need to find our information. Well, to consult an archive, what are we going to do? We're going to index the metadata that we have created. There's lots of metadata in the archive. It depends on the configuration of the archive, what we want to do with it, if we are going to index all that metadata, if we are going to index only a few items. And we can even go further and say, okay, let's go for a full text index on mated contents of some representations. Archiving consulting, yeah, of course, we need also access rules at that site. So we are going to specify some access rules. Access rules can be built upon metadata, can be built upon certain fixed rules. Certain package types are only available to certain users, or on metadata, if, for instance, after when a certain date has expired, if we are looking in the public sector, certain things need to be put on public from the moment that a certain preservation period has expired. Well, that can all be built into the archiving rules, into the access rules. And then, of course, we need an interface to consult or archive. That can be a specific consulting UI built to the archive's needs, or it can be just through API integrations from a business line application. So where we have at the bottom our backend system, which has produced a digital object. It produced that digital object, and at a certain point in time, it says, well, I need to migrate this, I need to put this into the archive. Well, it's creating a submission information package with the descriptive metadata, the technical metadata it has inside of the archive. It puts the digital object in it, and it ingests it into our long-term preservation system, which will convert it into an AIP by adding all the extra metadata, all the extra information coming from those checks that we've done, those transformations that we've done, enhancements that we've done. It sits like that into the archive, and then it can be requested from, it says public interface here, but it can be any interface, of course, depending on how the archive has been set up. If it is a public archive, if it's a local archive, those kind of things. So it can be requested. It can be set that, for instance, for this interface, only the metadata can be consulted. And if the backend system needs the document itself, it can also request it with all the information and only the document inside of it. So that all depends on the rules set up. And now I hope not everyone has fallen asleep, but I'm gone through my technical part. And if there are any questions, I will be glad to answer them.
Yeah, there was actually a discussion in the chat between Frederick and some other participants. Maybe Frederick, you can summarize that. It was about long-term, very, very long-term archiving.
Yeah, so but it's with regard to the long-term archiving that you can't guarantee the accessibility of a file for 50 years, and that's indeed the case. But that's exactly the purpose of the technology watch within the solution of the preservation planning. That because of first of all the storage is less of an issue these days with cloud storage providers, because the storage systems are foreseen to circumvent bitrot or other issues with regard to that. That's the storage layer becomes transparent. The software layer, that's the one of the obligations of the party that puts the archive solution in place. So you have to look at the different elements of your solution. So the 6 blocks: preservation planning, access control, data management, etc. So you have to maintain those elements and those modules, and to replace them with newer ones if one becomes obsolete. And thirdly, you have the format obsolence within your solution, where you have the technology watch. And with regard to the formats, there's different strategies that you can take. In some cases, what happens in this one, what happens often in reality is that you see that you can simply, that's also fine. But what happens often in archives is that they, the moment something is archived, that they immediately at ingest convert to an archiving format, so PDF or PDFA. That is something that happens quite often, very often PDFA, but in reality that's something that you don't need, because if you're going to archive a very recent version of let's say Word 2017, it's going to take you at least 5 years or 10 years before that format becomes obsolete. So there's no reason whatsoever to convert it, because you can't change it anyway in the archive, but you could, but you can still open it. It might be a good idea to convert it to PDF for your user group, so they are able to consult it from the web without the need of having a Word installed on their desktop. So that might be for a different reason, but specifically for archiving purposes, there's no need to convert from the start. Then you have Pronom. The Pronom database, and that's an online database in the UK that keeps track of all the different file formats that are out there and with their obsolescence date. So the moment something becomes obsolete, it's going to be published via Pronom, and you know that you have to convert those formats to either an archiving format or to refresh them, 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 to refresh So taking, let's say, a Word 95 and update it to a Word 2010. So that's an upgrade strategy. So that's one option. But you could also convert it at that point in time to PDF or a PDFA. And let's say in 20 years, if the PDF A becomes obsolete, you can then update again to whatever other formats, starting from your original one or from your converted formats, convert it to a new version again. So with regard to that, you can, that's the purpose of the solution. You can keep them for 10, 20, 30, 50 years. The same functionality is going to keep working regardless of the time that has elapsed. So that's you can implement different strategies there.